The smell of waffles crisping up on the griddle and freshly brewed strong coffee mingled with the soft country music playing from the radio inside the small Maple and Brew diner, nestled off a quiet road deep in rural Oregon. The place was modest, with a rustic charm. Faded red vinyl booths, old wooden tables, and a jukebox in the corner that barely worked anymore. Jake Miller, sleeves rolled up and his apron already stained with butter, moved behind the counter like a man who knew exactly where everything was. It was just another regular morning for him. Wake up at 5, make breakfast for the usuals, and get his 7-year-old daughter, Ellie, ready for school. The bell over the door chimed with that sharp, familiar jingle. Jake looked up, and in that instant he could tell something was different. A woman walked in. She clearly didn't belong to the scene around her. She wore a light beige wool coat with a refined cut and boots that probably had never touched the dirt of Route 86. Her brown hair was pulled back into a perfect bun, and the bag slung over her shoulder had the subtle shimmer of something expensive. But what really caught Jake's attention wasn't the understated luxury of her appearance. It was her eyes. There was an emptiness there, a kind of quiet confusion that didn't come from being lost geographically, but emotionally. It was the look of someone searching for herself. "Sit wherever you like," Jake said, drying his hands on the towel slung over his shoulder. She hesitated for a second, like picking a table was just too hard of a decision. Then, she walked slowly toward a corner by the window and sat down carefully, placing her bag in her lap. Jake grabbed a clean mug and walked over. "Coffee?" She looked up, surprised, and nodded. "Yes, please. Black. As strong as you've got." He poured her a cup and went back behind the counter, but he couldn't help sneaking glances at her now and then. Ellie, sitting at a little table in the corner with her colored pencils and sketchbook, was watching the stranger with the same quiet curiosity. A few minutes went by. Jake returned with a plate of waffles and fruit and gently set it in front of the woman. "On the house," he said with a simple smile. But I didn't order this," she said, surprised. "It's the best thing on the menu," he said, giving her a playful wink. Thought it was worth a shot. She gave a faint smile and slowly began to eat. But when it came time to pay, everything changed. She started digging through her bag, her movements growing more frantic. Her breathing quickened. Jake saw her face drain of color. "This can't be," she murmured. I lost my wallet." Jake took a couple steps closer. She looked genuinely embarrassed. "I'm so sorry, really. This has never happened before. I was sure I had it." Jake could have just brushed it off. He already had enough on his plate. Stacked up bills, a barely surviving business, and the responsibility of raising a kid on his own. But when he saw the panic in her eyes, he just sighed and gave a small shake of his head. "It's all right. Seriously. Coffee's on the house, remember? Consider it a welcome gift." She widened her eyes, like it was too strange a gesture to wrap her head around. "I insist on paying. I can transfer the money later or—" "No need." Jake smiled, genuinely. Sometimes people just need a little kindness. What Jake didn't know was that this woman wasn't just a lost tourist. She was Charlotte Bennett, CEO of one of the biggest tech companies on the East Coast. And that seemingly small gesture, it was about to change both their lives forever. The morning outside, Maple and Brew stayed cold and cloudy, but inside, the air was warmed by the smell of coffee, the distant whistle of a kettle, and the soft scratch of Ellie's colored pencils gliding over paper. Jake wiped down the griddle while throwing occasional glances at the woman still sitting near the window. She held the coffee mug with both hands, like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart. There was something vulnerable in that moment, a disarming stillness in someone who was clearly used to being in control of everything. Charlotte stared into the bottom of her empty mug like it held some kind of answer. But all she felt was the weight of confusion. Her head throbbed from trying to remember where she might have lost the wallet. At the gas station? In the cab? Or had someone stolen it without her noticing? She shrank into her seat, trying to make herself small, invisible. The world she came from was built on control, security, and routines planned down to the minute. None of that applied now. Here, in this diner forgotten by both God and the delivery apps, she was just another woman lost on the road. Jake walked over again, leaning slightly on the table with a dish towel still hanging from his shoulder. Need help with anything? Your phone, maybe? I've got a charger you can borrow if that's it. She looked up and took a deep breath. Actually, my phone's dead. And my wallet's gone. I've got no way to call a ride. I don't know anyone around here and… She let out a humorless laugh. I'm completely screwed. Jake tilted his head a little. Were you headed somewhere in particular? It was supposed to be a break, a weekend away from everything. Just some peace and quiet. She looked out the window, her eyes distant. But now I don't even know how to get back. Jake studied her face for a moment. She didn't seem like the kind of person who was used to setbacks. Probably the type who solved problems before they even had a chance to show up. Being this vulnerable. It had to be eating her alive. I could take you to the bank in town. It's about 10 minutes from here. Maybe they can help you out with a temporary card or something. Only if you want, of course. Charlotte looked at him, surprised. You already gave me coffee. Now you're offering to drive me to the bank? Well, I'm stubborn. And Ellie always says helping strangers is superhero stuff. Charlotte laughed. And for the first time since she'd stepped into that diner, it was real. Quick and quiet, but enough to lift a little of the weight off her shoulders. Jake, right? She asked. Jake Miller. I'm Charlotte. Charlotte Bennett. Jake extended his hand with a smile. Nice to meet you, Charlotte Bennett. They shook hands, and in that simple gesture, there was something more than politeness. There was recognition. Like, for a moment, two completely different worlds had crossed paths right there on that quiet stretch of road. You're welcome to stay here till my daughter finishes her drawing. Then we'll drive you to the bank. Just hope you don't mind the soundtrack. He nodded toward Ellie, who was now softly humming while sketching a flying bunny. Charlotte smiled gently. After the week I've had, children's music sounds like a blessing. Jake stepped away to help a new customer who had just walked in. Charlotte, meanwhile, glanced around the little café, the chipped counter, the fake flowers on the shelf, the scent of butter and cinnamon. It was so different from the world she knew, and yet, somehow, it felt more real. Jake finished jotting down the new order. An old man who always got the same combo: pancakes with bacon and a double coffee. With practiced ease, he returned to the griddle and got to work, though his eyes often drifted back to Charlotte, who now watched Ellie with a faint smile on her lips. The little girl had scooted her chair closer to the mysterious visitor, and, with the unfiltered honesty only a 7-year-old could get away with, started speaking without warning. You look sad, Ellie said, as casually as if she were commenting on the weather. Charlotte blinked, a bit surprised. I'm just a little confused, that's all. Ellie tilted her head, thoughtful. My dad says, when you're confused, the best thing to do is take a deep breath and eat something yummy. Charlotte let out a short laugh. Your dad sounds like a very wise man. He is, and he makes the best pancakes in the whole wide world. Jake, overhearing from a distance, just shook his head, a quiet smile slipping onto his face. Charlotte turned to Ellie. What about you? Do you help out here? Sometimes. I'm like a manager in training. Wow, that's important. Ellie nodded, very seriously. Super important. I even know where the straws are and how to fold napkins. Charlotte pretended to be impressed and clapped softly. You're going places, Manager Ellie. As the two of them kept chatting, Jake served plates and wiped down the counter, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Lightness. A few minutes later, Charlotte got up and walked to the counter. Her expression looked a little more relaxed. I'll take you up on that offer, Jake. If it still stands, the ride to the bank. He looked at her for a second and nodded. Of course. Just gotta close the kitchen for a bit. Ellie's used to it. Ellie raised her hand like she was in a classroom. I'll take care of the café. I'm the manager, remember? Jake smiled, grabbing his keys and coat. No taking orders, just supervising, and don't eat all the muffins. Promise, she said, crossing her fingers in the air. Charlotte and Jake stepped out the front door, side by side. The cold air wrapped around them, and a light fog hung over the road. The parking lot was nearly empty, except for Jake's old blue pickup truck, an older model, but well kept. Jake opened the passenger door. Welcome to my makeshift Uber. Charlotte got in with a faint smile and adjusted her coat in her lap. The seat was a bit stiff, and the truck smelled faintly of vanilla and gasoline, a weird mix, but oddly comforting. Thank you. Really, she said, looking over at him as he climbed in. "It's nothing." "No, it's not. You don't know me. I could be anyone." Jake shrugged as he started the engine. "You don't have to know everything about someone to tell when they need a little kindness." Charlotte didn't reply. She just stared out the window as the truck rumbled down the uneven asphalt road. The silence between them was easy, not awkward. The kind of rare silence that feels like a pause, not a gap. "You didn't ask where I'm from," she said, breaking the quiet. Jake raised his eyebrows. "Well, my daughter always told me not to ask questions if someone still looks like they're running from the answers." Charlotte laughed, and this time it wasn't held back. It was real, almost like a release. "Maybe I am trying to run from a few answers. Aren't we all?" Jake replied, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "But sometimes we find something better than answers." Charlotte turned to him, watching his calm, steady profile. And for the first time since her wallet had gone missing, she felt like maybe all of this had happened for a reason. And maybe she wasn't so lost after all. Jake's truck pulled up in front of the only bank in town, a red brick building with big windows and a slightly faded sign that read, Willow Creek Credit Union. It wasn't exactly the kind of bank Charlotte was used to. No marble floors, no mirrored glass, no receptionists in tailored suits. But still, it looked safe, even a little welcoming. Charlotte got out and adjusted her coat, taking a deep breath like she was about to walk into an interview. "Let's hope I can sort this out quickly," she murmured. Jake smiled. "I'll be close by if you need anything." She nodded with a small smile and stepped inside. Jake stayed out front, leaning against the truck with his arms crossed, watching the nearly empty street. An older woman passed by with a small dog, gave him a friendly wave, and he waved back. Around here, everybody knew everybody. Charlotte stepped into the bank and went straight to the counter. The teller, a middle-aged woman named Brenda, wore thin-rimmed glasses and a wool sweater embroidered with little flowers. "Good morning. How can I help you?" she asked with a friendly smile. Charlotte stepped closer. "Good morning. My name's Charlotte Bennett. I lost my wallet and have absolutely no access to my money. I was wondering if it's possible to issue a temporary card or if there's any way I could regain access to my account." Brenda typed something into the computer. "Do you have an account with us?" "Not exactly. My account's at East National Bank in New York." Brenda frowned slightly. "Ah, I see. Unfortunately, if you're not one of our customers, we can't issue any cards. You'd need to get in touch with your original bank." "I would try, but my phone's dead," Charlotte explained. "And I don't have the number memorized. Everything's saved on the device." Brenda bit her lower lip, clearly feeling bad. "I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett. The only thing I can suggest is using a landline to call your bank's customer service. They might be able to help you from there. But to issue anything, it'd have to be done in person or with online account access." Charlotte thanked her and walked out of the bank feeling even more frustrated than when she went in. Jake, seeing the look on her face, already knew the answer. "No luck?" "Nothing. I'm really locked out of everything. They can only help me if I go back to New York or manage to get into my email, the app, my passwords." She sighed, exhausted. "And of course I can't remember a single password without my phone." Jake scratched his beard, thinking. "So that means you've got no money, no way to contact anyone, and nowhere to go?" Charlotte let out a bitter laugh. "Exactly. And the most ironic thing is, just 2 days ago I was one of the most connected and accessible people in the country. Now, I feel like a character in a survival novel." Jake looked at her, considering. He was standing in front of a woman who clearly wasn't used to depending on anyone, and maybe that made her feel even more exposed now. "So, what are you going to do?" he asked, direct but without any judgment. Charlotte crossed her arms against her body, the cold wind cutting across her face. "I don't know, Jake. I don't have a plan." Which is weird because I always have a plan. Jake sighed and walked over to the passenger side, opening the door. "Come on." She looked at him, unsure. "Where to?" "Back to the café. Let's think this through calmly. You're not going to solve anything out here freezing in the street, and my daughter's probably finished 3 new drawings just waiting for you." Charlotte hesitated for a second, then nodded and got back into the truck. Jake walked around, climbed in, and started the engine. On the way back to the diner, Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about the fact that she was accepting help, again, from a complete stranger. But what was most surprising was, she didn't feel weak because of it. She felt human. The door to Maple and Brew opened again with its familiar sharp jingle. Ellie looked up from her table and smiled wide when she saw Charlotte walk in beside her dad. "You came back!" she exclaimed, excited. "I told you I'd be back, Manager Ellie," Charlotte replied, with a smile that even caught herself by surprise. Jake locked the door behind them and looked at his daughter. "Everything under control here?" "Absolutely. I just had to supervise an imaginary customer who wanted ice cream for breakfast," she said, pointing to a scribbled drawing of a stick figure holding an oversized spoon. Jake laughed and shrugged off his coat, hanging it behind the counter. Charlotte sat down again at the same table by the window, only now it didn't feel quite so cold. Jake brought over a glass of water and set it in front of her. "You look tired," he said. "I am. But I think it's more mental than physical." She looked around and took a deep breath. "This place is different, in a good way." "Willow Creek has that effect," Jake replied. "Feels like it's frozen in time. But sometimes that's exactly what we need." Charlotte rested her elbows on the table and watched Ellie, who was humming to herself as she stuck stickers into her notebook. The scene was so simple, it almost felt unreal. "Jake," she began hesitantly, "I really don't want to be a burden or take advantage of your kindness, but you're about to say you need a place to stay," he finished for her, crossing his arms. Charlotte looked embarrassed. "I wasn't going to ask, but maybe just check if you know any cheap inns around here. Something temporary, just until I can sort things out." Jake was quiet for a moment, scratching the back of his neck. Then he sighed. "Look, I've got a little guest room at my place. It's small, but it's got a bed and a door that closes. And Ellie already likes you. That's half the battle." Charlotte looked genuinely surprised. "Jake, you've already done too much. I can't accept that. You don't even know me." He shrugged. "Sometimes getting to know someone isn't about how much time you've spent with them. It's about what you see when you look in their eyes." She stared at him, unsure of how to respond. That kind of thing just wasn't said in the world she came from, and maybe that's why it hit so hard. "Just one night," she said, trying to sound firm. Jake smiled. "One night. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." "Okay. One night." That evening, the Miller house was lit with a warm glow coming from the kitchen. The smell of spaghetti with tomato sauce filled the air, and Charlotte, still wearing her coat, watched everything in silence. She felt out of place, but strangely, okay. "Do you like spaghetti?" Ellie suddenly asked, sitting at the table with a crumpled napkin in her lap. "I do, but I've never had any made by a 7-year-old chef," Charlotte said. "I helped stir the sauce, but my dad won't let me chop onions yet." Ellie made a face. "He says I have to wait until I'm 9. Jake served 3 steaming plates and sat down at the table with them. Charlotte looked at the scene. Simple, routine, domestic. Like it was a movie she'd never seen before. "The last time I had dinner with someone that wasn't during a business meeting," she started, then stopped halfway through the sentence. Jake looked at her calmly. "Well, welcome back then." Charlotte looked at him. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she needed to say anything else. She just smiled, picked up her fork, and ate. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the treetops when Charlotte woke up. The golden light gently filtered in through the window of Jake's small guest room, illuminating the faded wallpaper and the patchwork quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed. For a brief moment, she forgot where she was. The quiet, the smell of fresh bread coming from the kitchen, the muffled sound of soft voices. It was all so different from the blaring phone alarms, endless notifications, and deafening Manhattan traffic. She got up slowly, pulled on a wool sweater, and followed the comforting scent toward the kitchen. Jake was facing the stove, stirring a pot. Ellie sat at the table, legs swinging in the air, her hair in a slightly crooked ponytail. She smiled when she saw Charlotte walk in. "Good morning, mysterious guest," the girl said playfully. Charlotte smiled back. "Good morning, Manager Ellie. Looks like I survived your supervision." "Lucky you," Ellie replied seriously. "I'm pretty demanding." Jake turned around and handed Charlotte a mug of hot coffee. "Sleep well?" "Surprisingly, yes," she said, taking the mug. "That pillow's not made of clouds, but it did the job." Jake let out a soft laugh. That's the nicest thing anyone's ever said about that mattress. Charlotte sat down at the table, watching the little morning scene unfold in front of her with a quiet sense of wonder. There was something healing in that simplicity. In her old life, mornings began with reports, phone calls, and 8 a.m. meetings. Here, they began with pancakes and unicorn drawings. "Do you always have breakfast together like this?" she asked. "Whenever we can," Jake said. "The cafe opens later today, so we've got time to spare." Charlotte sipped her coffee slowly, feeling strangely at ease. After breakfast, Jake looked at her. "Well, I've got to swing by Maple and Brew to get a few things in order before the supply delivery. Ellie's going to school with the neighbor. Want to come with me? You can help carry boxes and pretend you're paying rent with honest labor." Charlotte raised an eyebrow, mock offended. "Temporary labor exploitation? Is that what you offer your guests?" "Only the special ones," Jake said, already grabbing the keys. The cafe was quiet when they arrived. The lights were still off, and the air held that cool stillness of a place closed just the night before. Jake unlocked the back door and stepped inside, flipping the lights on with a click. Charlotte stood in the middle of the space for a moment, seeing it differently now. It wasn't just a charming little diner. It was the heart of Jake's routine. This was where he supported his daughter, connected with his community, and probably spent most of his waking hours. "All right," Jake said, handing her an apron. "Moment of truth. I should warn you, I have zero tray or espresso skills." "No worries. Just don't drop the egg delivery, and you're already above average." Charlotte let out a laugh. She slipped the apron on, a little crooked, sure, and started helping organize the boxes coming through the back door. She fumbled the product names, tripped over a crate of milk, and nearly spilled a sack of flour. But she laughed at herself the whole time, and Jake never once made fun of her. In fact, he smiled, a real smile, calm and easy. Like seeing Charlotte out of her heels and her high-powered persona wasn't just amusing to him, it was endearing. And as the day slowly warmed outside, something inside Charlotte began to thaw too. She still didn't know exactly what she was doing there, but for the first time, she didn't feel in a rush to leave. The bell above the Maple and Brew's door rang, cutting through the quiet afternoon with its metallic chime. Jake, behind the counter, was drying glasses while Charlotte finished jotting down an order on the notepad he had improvised for her. They were alone, enjoying that slow rhythm between breakfast and lunch. But the moment they heard that sound, both instinctively turned toward the entrance. A tall man in a dark suit and an irritated expression stepped inside in a rush. His polished shoes stood out against the worn wooden floor, and his eyes scanned the room until they landed directly on Charlotte. She froze. "Charlotte?" he said, shocked and disbelieving. "Finally!" Jake furrowed his brow, glancing from Charlotte to the man, clearly confused. Charlotte, meanwhile, felt her stomach drop. "Mark," she said, unable to hide the tension in her voice. Mark Westfield, her personal assistant, or rather, the right arm of her corporate life. If he was there, it meant something was seriously wrong outside this little world she had just begun to discover. "Do you have any idea the chaos you've caused?" he said, striding closer. "No one's known where you were for days. The company's in panic mode. Your father is out of his mind. The board is already talking about appointing an interim replacement." Jake took a step forward, instinctively moving to stand next to Charlotte. "Is there a problem here?" Mark looked him up and down, his typical coldness clear. Someone who had never had to get his hands dirty with manual labor. "Is this your driver?" Charlotte almost laughed out of nervousness. "Jake owns this place, and he's been more helpful than any executive I know." Mark ignored her comment. "Charlotte, we need to go. Now, the jet's waiting. You can explain on the way back. But the longer we wait, the more you risk losing control of everything you've built over the years." Jake stepped back slightly, clearly understanding this wasn't the moment to intervene. But Charlotte felt the emptiness growing inside her. The weight of the world she thought she had left behind was coming back full force. She looked at Jake, then at the apron stained with flour she was still wearing. Finally, she turned to Mark, with his perfectly tailored suit and urgent tone. "I'm not ready," she said finally. "Charlotte, this isn't a choice. You have a company to run, investors waiting on decisions. Your disappearance is being seen as instability." She pressed her fingers against the counter. Maybe I need to be unstable for a while. She took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. Maybe I need to understand who I am outside of my packed schedule and endless meetings. This isn't you, Mark insisted, now calmer but still impatient. You're not the woman in an apron serving coffee in some forgotten corner of the map. Jake took a discreet step back, but he didn't take his eyes off her. Charlotte breathed deeply. There was a rift forming between two worlds, the one she had left behind and the one she was starting to discover, and she was right in the middle of it. Maybe you're right, she said, staring at Mark. But I'm starting to think that being this woman in an apron might be the most real thing I've ever lived. The silence that followed was heavy. Mark shook his head, incredulous. Fine, but don't expect the world to wait for you. He turned on his heel and left, leaving only the sound of the doorbell and the lingering smell of coffee in the air. Charlotte didn't move. Jake slowly approached. Are you okay? She didn't answer right away, but when she finally looked up, he saw it. Something inside her had shifted. Not yet, but maybe I'm starting to be. That night, Charlotte sat on the porch of Jake's house, wrapped in a thin blanket, staring up at the starry sky. The silence around her was almost complete, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. It was a calmness she never would have known in her old life. Jake appeared with 2 mugs of hot chocolate, and without saying a word, handed one to her before sitting down on the step next to her. Ellie fell asleep in the middle of a story about a rabbit who opened a cupcake bakery, he said, smiling. Charlotte laughed, hugging the mug with both hands. I wish I had had a childhood like hers. Jake looked at her sideways, curious. You didn't? She shook her head. My dad started training me for the family business when I was 9. While other girls were learning how to ride bikes, I was learning how to interpret contracts. Every choice I made was measured. Every mistake, a potential disaster. I never had room to fail. Jake nodded slowly, as if those words made more sense than they should have. And now? Now I've failed. I disappeared. The world I built is on the brink of falling apart. And the worst part is, instead of panic, all I feel is a relief I can't explain. The silence returned for a moment, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Sometimes, Jake said finally, you don't realize you've been carrying the world on your shoulders until you let it drop. Charlotte turned to him, her eyes searching his calm face for something. Maybe permission to fall apart, maybe understanding. And you? Have you ever felt that? After my wife died, he answered, voice low. I tried to keep everything going. The diner, the house, Ellie. On the outside, it looked like I was holding it together. But inside, I was just running on autopilot, until one day I just couldn't get out of bed. Ellie came into the room and said, Daddy, the world's waiting, but it can wait until you breathe. Charlotte felt a lump rise in her throat. Jake never overshared, and that rare glimpse of vulnerability felt like a gift. I don't know what to do, Jake, she confessed. If I go back, I lose this. I lose you and Ellie. But if I stay, I lose everything I've built. Jake didn't respond right away. He stood and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out into the night like he was trying to find answers between the trees. You don't have to decide right now, he said, still not looking at her. But be honest. Not with me. With yourself. Charlotte stayed silent, staring into the mug cooling between her hands. For the first time in her life, there was no spreadsheet to guide her, no risk report, no schedule. Just feelings, just choices. Jake turned back to her, his gaze steady, calm, but serious. Just don't leave me halfway, Charlotte. Not me, not Ellie. Those words hit harder than any boardroom ultimatum, because they didn't come from obligation or strategy or pressure. They came from truth. Later that night, alone in the guest room, Charlotte took her phone out of her backpack. It had fully charged earlier that day, but she still hadn't turned it on, not since Mark left. She stared at the black screen for a long time. It would take just one touch, one call, and the world she had left behind would come crashing back. But she didn't press anything. She just set it down on the dresser. Still off. That night, for the first time in a long time, she slept without dreams and without fear. 2 days had passed since Mark's visit, and Charlotte still hadn't turned on her phone. Every morning was a small choice. Return to the chaos of her former life, or dive deeper into this new and strange world where the day began with the smell of waffles and the sound of a child's laughter? She kept choosing the second, and without realizing it, the town began choosing her back. That Saturday morning, Maple and Brew was busier than usual. Soft sunlight streamed through the windows, lighting up the familiar faces of regulars, farmers, retired couples, truckers stopping before hitting the road again. And there, in the middle of it all, was Charlotte, in an apron, pen in her pocket, and a quiet smile on her lips. She already knew that Mrs. Jenkins liked her coffee with extra hot milk, that Mr. Ray put ketchup on his omelet, and that little 5-year-old Thomas only ate pancakes if they had fruit faces on them. Jake watched her from behind the counter, pretending to look busy, but unable to hide the light in his eyes. Seeing Charlotte settle in so quickly was unexpected and captivating. "Hey, Jake," said one of the locals, Marlene, walking up to the register. "Is the new girl family of yours?" "No, ma'am. Just someone who showed up at the right time." Marlene smiled, glancing at Charlotte from across the room. "This town needed new energy. She's got it, you know?" Jake just nodded, a quiet smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. By noon, the rush had started to fade. Charlotte was wiping down a table when Ellie burst through the door holding a colorful drawing in her hands. "Charlotte, look at this!" Charlotte crouched down and took the crayon-covered paper. "Wow, is that us?" "It's you, Daddy, and me," Ellie said proudly. "And the cafe. You even have your apron." Charlotte couldn't hold back a chuckle. In the drawing, she was smiling, with a giant heart on her chest. This is way more beautiful than any portrait I've ever had in my boardroom." Ellie threw her arms around her without warning, spontaneous the way only children know how to be. Charlotte froze for a second. She wasn't used to unfiltered affection. But then, something inside her cracked open. She hugged the little girl back, holding her tightly. In that moment, she realized that part of her hard shell was beginning to soften. Jake walked over, drying his hands on a dish towel. "Looks like Ellie just officially promoted you to Saturday's favorite person." Charlotte smiled, but there was something else in her expression. A quiet glimmer of emotion in her eyes. "Can I ask you something?" she said, looking up at Jake. "Of course. How did you manage to be all this, after everything you've been through?" Jake paused for a moment before answering. "I didn't. Not all at once. But Ellie reminded me day after day that even after the worst kind of pain, life keeps going, and that we can build something new, even if it's on the ruins of what's left." Charlotte swallowed hard. It wasn't some neat self-help book answer. It was a lived truth. "And now?" she asked quietly. Jake looked at her deeper than before. "Now I just try to be whole wherever my feet are. And today, my feet are here." Charlotte nodded slowly, like she was etching those words into her heart. That afternoon, as she swept the cafe floor and hummed a forgotten melody, she didn't notice the curious glances from neighbors walking by. She wasn't the strange woman from the road anymore. She was becoming something else, the cafe woman. And without realizing it, she was winning over the town and maybe carving out a permanent place in the hearts that lived there. The afternoon breeze drifted gently through the streets of Willow Creek. Maple and Brew had already closed its doors for the day, and Charlotte was helping Jake clean up the kitchen, just as she had every afternoon since she arrived. The simple, repetitive, almost meditative routine was starting to feel natural to her. While Jake rinsed dishes and Charlotte sorted the silverware, a faint notification sound echoed from the back of the cafe. Charlotte frowned. "Did you hear that?" Jake nodded, turning off the faucet. "Think that was your phone. It's still in the stockroom, remember?" She hesitated. She hadn't turned on the device since she got there. She'd been avoiding the world she came from like someone avoids an old wound. But now, something about that sound felt different. A tug of instinct. She walked toward the small back room where her backpack had sat untouched since the day she arrived. Her phone was on the table, screen flashing, 21 unread messages, 6 missed calls, 1 urgent notification. Charlotte swallowed hard and, for the first time in days, unlocked the screen. The first message was from her father. "Charlotte, what is going on? The media knows. This is spiraling out of control. The second, from an online news outlet. CEO Charlotte Bennett disappears without explanation. Bennett tech shares drop 12%. And the third was a video. With her heart pounding, she hit play. It was a TV news report, footage of her at public events, clips from old interviews, and then screenshots from online forums speculating about her disappearance. Some mentioned burnout, others escape, and one or two hinted at emotional instability. Charlotte paused the video, feeling the room spin. What had once been just an unannounced sabbatical was now a headline. The reputation she had built with so much effort was now a target. She stepped out of the room slowly, phone still in hand. Jake noticed her expression the moment she reappeared. Did something happen? Charlotte nodded, her expression a mix of guilt and panic. They know. Who? Everyone, the media, the shareholders, my dad. I was gone too long. And now I'm all over the news sites as the CEO who ran away. Jake stepped closer, trying to meet her eyes. Did you run away? She hesitated. Maybe. She took a deep breath, but not from the job. I ran from myself. And now it's costing me everything I built. Jake crossed his arms, thoughtful. Do you want to go back? The question was simple, but it carried enormous weight. Charlotte didn't know how to answer right away. She looked at the counter she had just cleaned, heard Ellie's distant laughter from the backyard, and smelled the cornbread baking in the oven. This wasn't just a hiding place anymore. It felt like home. I don't know what I want, she finally said, but I do know what I don't want. I don't want to live trapped in a life that looks perfect on the outside, but feels empty inside. Jake nodded, but his expression had shifted. More guarded now. He understood, but he was also afraid. I just need more time, she added, almost like a quiet plea. Jake, however, stepped back a bit. Time's a luxury, Charlotte. But here, we need presence, especially Ellie. Charlotte felt the sting. It wasn't a threat, just a hard truth. She was torn in two, and that fracture was already beginning to take a toll. I won't hurt you two, she promised. Jake looked at her with tenderness, but also with the cautious gaze of someone who'd had promises broken before. Then just don't wait until it's too late to decide. That night, Charlotte stayed up for hours, her phone lying next to the bed. The messages kept coming. Board meeting summons, ultimatums, pleas from her father. But she didn't answer a single one. She was stuck in a crossroads. And this time, she knew the right path wouldn't be written in a contract. 2 more days passed since Charlotte had unlocked her phone and seen her old world trying to pull her back with full force. Since then, she hadn't touched the device. It stayed off, tucked in the drawer of the guest room like a ticking time bomb. And even so, she woke up every morning at 6, put on her apron, and helped Jake at Maple and Brew. It was strange how natural everything there started to feel. That Thursday morning, as she was organizing tea bags on a shelf, Ellie came running into the cafe with a colorful poster in hand. Charlotte, you have to see this. She stopped at the counter and carefully unrolled the poster. Willow Creek Autumn Fair, Charlotte read aloud, smiling. Pumpkin pies, live music, and a kids' costume parade? Yes, and this year they're doing a decorated booth contest. Guess who's in charge of one? Who? Daddy. Jake appeared behind the counter just then, already laughing. Well, technically we're in charge. Ellie volunteered me, and apparently volunteered you too. Charlotte raised an eyebrow. Me? I'm not even from here. Exactly why you should do it, Ellie said, full of excitement. It'll be your official debut as an almost citizen of Willow Creek. Jake leaned on the counter, looking at Charlotte with a soft, meaningful smile. If you want to help, of course. No pressure. But I think the town's already decided you're one of us. Charlotte felt a strange mix of warmth and unease in her chest. Being included, being expected, it felt good, but it was also terrifying. She had always been the observer, the distant leader, the woman behind the boardroom table. And now, she was being invited to help decorate a cider and pie stand with handmade crafts. So, what do we need to do? She asked after a brief pause. Ellie jumped with joy. We need hay, pumpkin lights, orange fabric, and a cool name for our booth. Jake smiled. Well, I guess it's official. We're in. In the days that followed, Charlotte threw herself into the autumn fair like it was a top-secret mission. Only instead of spreadsheets, there were sacks of straw. Instead of meetings, there were trips to the local hardware store for paint and nails. She and Ellie spent an entire afternoon painting a wooden sign with the booth's name, Maple Sweets. Jake built a simple wooden frame behind the café, and as the project took shape, the three of them laughed together like it had always been part of their daily lives. Charlotte found herself smiling often, even laughing out loud. She went to bed tired, but in a good, light way. Something inside her was being rebuilt, not with concrete, but with human connection she hadn't known she was missing. On the night before the fair, Ellie showed up in a pumpkin costume sewn by the neighbor who did alterations. "Are you going to dress up too, Charlotte?" she asked, eyes sparkling. Charlotte laughed. "I don't have a costume, just suits and expensive shoes." "We can improvise," Jake said, appearing with an orange scarf. "You could be the cinnamon fairy." She looked at him, laughing. "That's ridiculous. It's Willow Creek," he corrected, a playful twinkle in his eye. That night, Charlotte looked at her reflection in the guest room mirror. She was wearing a plaid shirt, jeans, and the orange scarf tied around her neck. She looked like someone else. No, she looked like herself. For the first time in a very long time. And for the first time, too, she found herself deeply wishing this new reflection would last longer than just one fall season. The Saturday morning sun shone brightly, and Willow Creek looked like something out of a postcard. Amber-colored leaves blanketed the ground like a golden carpet, and the booths of the autumn fair lined the town square, decked out with corn husks, paper lanterns, and carved pumpkins. Charlotte looked around, amazed. She never imagined something so simple could be so beautiful. She wore her plaid shirt and the orange scarf Jake had jokingly called her fall uniform. The Maple Sweets booth was ready. Little baskets of apple pies, bottles of homemade cider, and even a checkered tablecloth laid out to perfection. Ellie, proudly sporting her pumpkin costume, was handing out spice cake samples and flashing her trademark smile to every passerby. "We are officially crushing it," Jake said, stopping beside Charlotte with his hands on his hips. "Cutest booth at the fair. And that's saying something, considering the sheriff's giving out free donuts." Charlotte smiled, eyes gleaming. "I've never been part of anything like this, not even when I was a kid." "Well, you never forget your first time, right?" he said, looking at her in a way that made her stomach flutter. Charlotte quickly looked away, focusing back on the pies. The morning was a hit. The booth stayed busy the entire time. Kids came to see Ellie, adults complimented Jake's recipes, and many locals chatted with Charlotte like she had always belonged there. She was surprised by how much that pleased her. Around noon, while Jake helped two older folks decide which pie to take home, Charlotte stepped away for a few minutes to grab more cider from Jake's truck. That's when she heard the voice. "Well, didn't expect to find you selling pies in the middle of nowhere, Oregon." She froze, turned slowly, and there he was, Richard Bennett, her father. He wore a dark blue blazer that clashed completely with the warm autumn tones of the fair. His expression was exactly as Charlotte remembered, laced with pressure, worry, and just a touch of judgment. "Dad?" she said, surprised. "You stopped answering. The board came to me. The shareholders are panicking. And then Mark told me everything." He glanced around, visibly uncomfortable. "This is what you're doing while your company's name is sinking?" For a moment, Charlotte felt her world tremble. She took a deep breath and said, "I'm living, Dad." He scoffed. "Living? Charlotte, you don't have that luxury. You have obligations, responsibilities, people who depend on you. This," he gestured toward the booth, "this isn't you." Her chest tightened. His words still had weight, but now she had something she never had before, conviction. "What if it is?" she asked, her voice steady. "What if this is the part of me I've always suppressed, but that finally has room to exist? This is a temporary breakdown. You'll come back. We'll fix the damage. I've already scheduled a meeting with the board on Monday." Charlotte shook her head. "I'm not ready." "You don't need to be ready. You just need to do what has to be done." That's when Jake appeared, carrying a crate of cider bottles. "Everything okay here?" he asked, sensing the tension thick in the air. Richard looked him up and down, then turned back to his daughter. "I see what's going on. You've fallen for this man, haven't you?" Charlotte didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jake stood still, surprised, but didn't back down. "This isn't about him," Charlotte said. "It's about me." Richard stepped back, clearly displeased. "Think carefully, Charlotte. You have until tomorrow." Then he turned and walked off, disappearing among the booths, leaving behind the scent of pies, cider, and a decision that could no longer be delayed. Jake stayed beside her, quiet. "Is he right?" he asked, without bitterness. "Are you leaving?" Charlotte looked at him. Then at Ellie, dancing with the other children. Then at the booth, crafted with so much care. And she whispered, her voice tight with emotion, "I don't know yet." But for the first time, she wanted to find out. The fair wound down as the sunset painted the sky in orange and pink, and the final notes of the local band echoed through the square. Charlotte helped Jake take down the booth in silence. Ellie had already gone off with the neighbor to play with her friends, giving them a rare moment alone. But the silence between them wasn't the same as before. It was heavy. "Are you going with him?" Jake asked suddenly, folding a tarp with overly careful hands. Charlotte gripped the wooden sign tightly, avoiding his eyes. "I don't know. That's what you've been saying for days." She sighed and gently set the sign down on the ground. "And it's the truth. Jake, I built a company from scratch, made insane sacrifices, pulled countless all-nighters, spent weekends in meetings, let friendships die, all for a legacy I've been carrying since I was a child." He crossed his arms, not in anger, but with quiet resolve. "And now that you've finally stopped to breathe, you realize you don't even know who you are outside of all that." Charlotte nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. "Exactly. I've never had space to just be me. I was always the heir, the leader, the CEO, until now." Jake looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I get it, and I'm not going to ask you to choose between two lives. But I do need to know if this," he gestured around them, "is just a comfortable escape, or something you actually want to build." Charlotte felt the full weight of those words. Jake wasn't asking for promises. He was asking for courage. "I'm not running from anything," she said, her voice soft but sure. "For the first time, I'm running towards something." "Then what's holding you back?" She bit her lip, hesitant. "Fear. Of disappointing my father. Of giving up everything I built. Of choosing wrong." She paused, breathing deep. "Of losing myself all over again." Jake nodded. He didn't say anything at first, just stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "If you decide to leave, you'll be taking a part of me with you. And a part of Ellie, too." He gave a sad smile. "But if you decide to stay, I don't want it to be out of pity or exhaustion." She looked him in the eyes. "It wouldn't be." "Then figure out what it would be." He stepped back. "And come find me. When you know." That night, Charlotte returned to the guest room. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands in her lap, staring at the wall. The fair was over, but the real event was just beginning. The final showdown between who she'd been and who she wanted to become. She picked up her phone. She called. The voice on the other end answered almost immediately. "Charlotte?" "Dad." A sigh. "Finally. So?" She closed her eyes for a moment, like diving into deep water. "I'm not coming back. Not now." Silence. "What do you mean, not now?" "I need more time. To think, to live, to figure out if that world is still my dream, or just yours." Richard Bennett didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was colder. "So you're willing to throw it all away?" "I'm not throwing it away. I'm saving what I might still be." He let out a humorless laugh. "Very well. Just don't expect the world to wait for you." Charlotte looked out the window. The sky was clear, and the stars shone with a brilliance she hadn't seen in the New York night for years. "I know," she hung up. For the first time, she felt fear and freedom occupying the same space inside her, and strangely, it made her smile. The next morning, Charlotte woke up early, earlier than usual. The sky was still painted in soft shades of blue and gray, and the entire town seemed to still be asleep. But she wasn't. She got dressed quickly, jeans, boots, and a worn wool sweater Ellie had left on her bed, in case it got cold. That simple gesture from the little girl made her heart tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She walked down the stairs in silence and found the kitchen empty. Jake and Ellie had already gone. There was no more smell of coffee, no faint sound of waffles sizzling on the griddle. It was as if the silence was saying, "You took too long." Charlotte didn't waste a second. She grabbed the keys to the old truck Jake used for grocery runs and headed to the town square, where there was a small real estate office. The agent, a friendly woman named Sarah, looked surprised to see someone arriving so early. "You want to rent the old craft shop space?" she asked, pulling out the listing. "Yes," Charlotte replied, "and I want to do it as soon as possible." "May I ask what you're planning to open?" Charlotte gave a small smile. "I'm still deciding between a reading cafe or pies with a purpose, but one thing's certain. It'll smell like cinnamon and have space for kids to draw on the walls." Sarah laughed. "Sounds like Willow Creek just got its first CEO turned baker." With the paperwork signed and the key in hand, Charlotte drove back to Maple and Brew. Jake was there, as always, sleeves rolled up and a towel slung over his shoulder. The place was quieter than usual. Ellie was drawing silently in the corner, her face a little less bright than normal. Charlotte stopped at the door, hesitated for a moment, then walked in. Jake glanced at her but didn't say anything. He just kept wiping down the counter. She walked over slowly and placed the building key on the counter. "I rented a space in town." Jake paused, lifting his gaze with a spark of curiosity. "Oh yeah?" "Yes, I'm opening something. I don't know the name yet, but it'll have coffee and maybe cakes, assuming I don't burn them all." One corner of his mouth twitched, threatening to smile, but it didn't quite give in. Charlotte took a deep breath. "I chose to stay, Jake, not out of impulse, not to run away, but because this is where I want to try being myself, whatever that means." Jake watched her for a long moment. His eyes said more than any words. He wanted to believe her, but he needed to feel it. "And what about your company? Your father?" "I won't lie. That still haunts me, but not as much as the thought of living my entire life in a place where my laughter needs permission." Jake finally let out a sigh. He picked up the key she had placed on the counter, turned it between his fingers, and handed it back with a quiet, supportive gesture. "Then welcome back. Really back this time." Charlotte smiled, relieved, but something was still missing. She turned toward Ellie, who was watching her with cautious eyes. She approached and knelt down to the little girl's level. "Hey, boss. I was thinking, do you think I can still be your Saturday morning assistant?" Ellie crossed her arms. "Only if you promise not to leave again without saying anything." Charlotte nodded, tearful. "I promise. And this time it's for real." The girl hugged her tightly, and Charlotte felt her heart stitch back together just a little more. That afternoon, Jake took her to the empty building that was now officially hers. The windows were dusty, the floor creaked, and the walls were in desperate need of paint. But Charlotte saw potential in it. "You know," she said, looking around, "maybe this place doesn't have to be perfect. Maybe I don't have to be either." Jake smiled. "And even so, it might be exactly what we needed." She looked at him. It really might. And there, surrounded by loose floorboards and the scent of old wood, they shared a look that didn't promise a happy ending. It promised a real beginning. Dust danced in the air as Charlotte swept the floor of the old commercial space that was now hers. The rain-worn facade, crooked shelves, and stains on the wooden boards felt, paradoxically, like signs of rebirth, not ruin. Jake showed up in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and a soft smile. "Figured you could use some backup," he said, handing her one of the mugs. Charlotte took it with hands still dusty and let out a sigh. "I think I underestimated the number of cobwebs per square meter in this place. Webs, dust, cracks. Sounds like a metaphor for life, doesn't it?" She laughed. "And even so, I still want to stay here." Jake watched her for a moment, then stepped closer and picked up a tape measure she had dropped. "Have you thought of a name yet?" Charlotte shook her head. "I have a few ideas. Refugio, maybe, or Raíces. Something that represents what this place is becoming to me." Jake nodded. "Both are beautiful, but I'd vote for Second Chance." Charlotte paused, surprised. Her eyes met his. That name said it all. Maybe that's the perfect name. In the days that followed, the town seemed to conspire in her favor. Neighbors stopped by to help with painting. Ellie showed up with colorful drawings she wanted to hang on the walls. Even Mrs. Jenkins brought over a pie to keep the workers fed. Charlotte felt something growing inside her. And for the first time, it wasn't a business project or a growth strategy. It was belonging. But on Wednesday morning, while she was cleaning the front window of her new space, her phone vibrated in her pocket. She hesitated for a second before answering. "Charlotte Bennett," she said, already bracing for the usual pressure. But it wasn't her father. It was Vivian Cross, the chairwoman of the Bennett Tech Board. "Charlotte, I'm glad you picked up. I won't take up much of your time. I just need you to listen." Charlotte straightened her posture. "I'm listening. The board voted last night. We agreed you need time. But we also agreed the company needs steady leadership." Charlotte felt her chest tighten. "You're removing me? Temporarily, as CEO. You still hold your seat on the board, of course, and your shares remain unchanged. But we've decided to appoint an interim." Charlotte bit her lower lip, trying to absorb the news. "Who?" "Your father." The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet. "I see." Vivian paused briefly, but it wasn't a unanimous decision. "Some of us believe you still have time to come back and rebuild, if you act quickly. A public statement, a press conference. You're still the heart of the company, Charlotte. You just need to remind people of that." Charlotte thanked her, ended the call, and stood frozen in front of the window for several long minutes. Jake, walking down the street with a toolbox in hand, caught the distant look on her face. "You okay?" She turned slowly. "They took my seat, replaced me with my father." Jake didn't say a word. He just stood there, waiting for her to say what she needed to. "But they gave me a chance to go back. If I want to. And do you?" Charlotte looked at the building, at the fresh paint on the walls, at the neighbor waving from the flower shop, at Ellie drawing hearts on the sidewalk with colorful chalk. And then she looked at Jake. "I don't know what I want." "There," Jake nodded. "Maybe that says enough." She took a deep breath. The offer was tempting, a triumphant return, control restored. But in that moment, with paint on her hands and her heart full of doubts, Charlotte realized something. Sometimes, stepping away from the throne is the first step toward freedom. That night, she wrote a short email. No drama, no justifications. "Thank you for the opportunity, but I'm exactly where I need to be. Charlotte Bennett." And she hit send, with trembling hands, but a soul at peace. The sign hanging above the door read, in hand-painted cursive letters, "Second Chance, Café and Stories." Charlotte looked at it with misty eyes and flour-dusted hands. The café wasn't perfect. The chairs were donated, the mugs were thrifted, and the counter had a visible chip on the left side. But still, it was hers, built with her own hands, with the help of the community, and with every choice made from the heart, not the head. It was Saturday morning, and the grand opening was about to begin. Ellie, wearing a floral apron made just for the occasion, sat behind a little table with colored pencils and sheets of paper, running the kids' drawing station. She had already declared that every drawing would be hung on the walls. "Because this place needs color," she said. Jake was outside, arranging makeshift benches with soft cushions in front of the cafe window. He wore one of his rare, crooked, but completely genuine smiles. Charlotte was nervous, more than she'd ever been at any shareholder meeting, more than at her first press conference as CEO. Because here, this morning, there were no masks. Everything was real and vulnerable. When the doors finally opened, the sound of the bell echoed like a milestone. The first to enter were the neighbors, Mrs. Jenkins, carrying a pie as a gift, Mr. Ray with his classic baseball cap and a toothless grin. Then came families, young couples, curious kids. The air was filled with the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon bread. And then something unexpected happened. Charlotte saw, standing at the entrance, Vivian Cross, the chairwoman of Bennett Tech. She wore a cream blazer and a pair of shoes that screamed, "Manhattan executive anywhere, except here." Charlotte walked over, surprised. "Vivian? I came as a customer, not an executive." She looked around, clearly taken in. "I admit I wanted to understand what could possibly be more important than your own company." Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but Vivian raised a hand. No need to explain. I already get it. She pointed to a shelf lined with children's books, homemade cakes, and a box of colored pencils. There's more life in this place than in any board meeting I've ever attended. Charlotte smiled, deeply moved. I never knew I could have both. Now, I just want one. Vivian nodded, then extended her hand. Good luck, Charlotte. Thank you. Really. After she left, Jake came over. He was holding a rose he'd picked from the neighbor's garden and gently placed it in a glass on the counter. A café with flowers. Now it's complete. Charlotte laughed. All it was missing was that romantic touch. He looked at her, serious, for a moment. I didn't want to pressure you. But seeing you choose to stay, he paused, was the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. Charlotte met his gaze, her eyes shimmering. And without hesitation, she reached out and held his hand across the counter. Thank you for giving me the time to figure out who I was and who I wanted to be. Jake smiled, and this time it was a full, unguarded smile. Hours later, after the rush had died down, Ellie was pinning one of her drawings to the bulletin board near the entrance. It was a picture of a house with lit-up windows, a coffee shop next door, and 3 stick figures holding hands. At the top of the paper, written in uneven childlike letters, Our Place. Charlotte looked at it, her heart tightening. Yes, it truly was. The week following the grand opening was intense and magical. Second Chance became the talk of the town. Kids left drawings every day. The elderly stopped by for coffee and conversation, and even folks from nearby towns started visiting, curious about the café that feels like home. Charlotte worked hard, but she had never felt so light in her exhaustion. She belonged there. With Jake, their moments became more frequent, more intimate, even if quietly so. They exchanged glances, full of silence and understanding, shared tasks, walked home together. Ellie treated Charlotte like family, and from time to time would casually say things like, "When you marry Daddy, can I be the flower girl?" Charlotte just laughed, but inside, her heart skipped a beat every time. But peace sometimes is like glass, beautiful but fragile. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, Charlotte received an envelope on official letterhead, dropped off by a hurried courier. When she opened it, the floor seemed to shift beneath her. It was a court summons. Her father, Richard Bennett, had filed a formal petition to review the terms of her shareholder control of the company. The claim was simple. Charlotte abandoned her responsibilities and has shown clear disinterest in the presidency. She sat down, her hand trembling, reading and rereading the words. This wasn't just a professional attack. It was emotional devastation. Jake walked in minutes later and sensed the tension immediately. What happened? Charlotte handed him the paper, too stunned to speak. He read it silently, his jaw tightening. When he finished, he returned the document without saying a word for a moment. He doesn't give up easy, huh? He never has. And I've always feared that. Jake knelt in front of her, steady and grounded. What are you going to do? Charlotte looked at him, eyes glistening with tears. I don't know. Part of me wants to fight. Part of me wants to run. And part of me just wants to stay right here and pretend none of this is happening. You can do whatever you want, Jake said gently. You just can't run from yourself again. You came all the way here, chose this place. Now you have to choose whether you'll live looking forward or keep trying to fix what's already behind you. She closed her eyes. His words cut deep because they were true. And what if fighting for this means losing you? Jake took her hand in his. You won't lose me by facing your ghosts, Jake said softly. But you could lose yourself if you keep pretending they don't exist. Charlotte said nothing, but it was an active silence now, one of reflection, of decision. That night, she walked alone to the lake just outside town. The sky reflected off the dark water, and the air smelled of fallen leaves. She sat by the shore, the envelope resting in her lap. Tears fell, quiet ones, not from despair, but from release. She folded the paper carefully and slid it back into the envelope. Then, on the back, she wrote, You always wanted me to be strong, Dad. Now that I am, you're trying to pull me back. But I'm not coming back. Not out of fear. Charlotte, She didn't throw it away. She kept it, because she didn't want to erase the past. She just didn't want to live in it anymore. Back in town, Jake stood at the gate waiting for her, his expression calm but intense. She walked up to him and, before a single word was spoken, wrapped her arms around him. Not like someone begging for safety, but like someone who had finally found solid ground. Jake held her close, and in that moment, Charlotte knew. She didn't have to run from anything anymore, because she was exactly where she was meant to be. Autumn slowly turned to winter in Willow Creek. The trees had shed most of their leaves. The air grew crisper, and the scent of pine began to replace pumpkin in every house on the block. But inside, Second Chance, Café and Stories, the warmth still lived. Charlotte stood by the window, arranging a basket of freshly baked cranberry loaves. Outside, Ellie helped Jake set up a tiny Christmas tree in the front yard. The little girl insisted on hanging a paper ornament that read, in colorful letters, "This place is magic." Charlotte smiled, because she knew it was true. The cafe had become more than just a business. It was a gathering place, a home for anyone needing comfort, laughter, or simply a cup of tea and someone to listen. People came not just to consume, but to belong. Charlotte had made peace with her old life, her father's lawsuit, quietly withdrawn a few weeks later, once he realized she wasn't going to bend. Instead of fighting back, she wrote him a letter, sincere, firm, and full of love. "I'm not against you, but I'm finally for myself." It was the last thing she ever said to him, and maybe the first truly honest thing she'd said since she was a teenager. She didn't need to defeat her father, she just needed to free herself from him, and she did. That afternoon, after closing, Jake came into the cafe with a small box wrapped in twine. "It's not a ring," he said quickly, grinning before she could say a word. Yet, Charlotte laughed, surprised and touched. "So what is it?" "Open it." She untied the twine, opened the box, and inside was a key. She looked at him confused. Jake tilted his head toward the outside of the cafe. "To the house. Our house. Ellie and I voted. It was unanimous." Charlotte's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" Jake looked at her the way he always did when he meant something deeply. "I'm sure. You're not a guest here, not a visitor. You're part of this, of us." She gripped the key like it was worth more than gold. "Then I guess it's time to hang my coat by the door, huh?" Jake smiled. "Or toss the coat altogether. You've got a home now." On Christmas Eve, the cafe stayed open for a few hours just for the town. A piano played quietly in the corner, children sang carols off-key and joyfully, and adults toasted with hot cocoa and cookies baked by Ellie. Charlotte sat by the fireplace with Jake. Ellie lay asleep across her lap, exhausted, but smiling. "You know," Charlotte said, running her fingers through the girl's hair, "if someone had told me my fresh start would begin with a flat tire and a cup of coffee in the middle of nowhere, I'd have laughed." Jake looked at her. "And now?" She met his gaze, serenity in her eyes. "Now, I understand that sometimes life has to break us, so we can find ourselves in the pieces." Jake leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Did you find all the pieces?" "Not all of them," she whispered. "But I found the most important ones." She looked around. Love, simplicity, truth. Outside, snow began to fall gently, as if time itself had slowed down for that moment. Inside the cafe, the warmth was more than physical. It was human. It was home. And just like that, Charlotte Bennett, former CEO, former runaway, and now a whole woman, finally stopped running, because at last, she was exactly where her heart had wanted to be all along, home.